Genesis 33. Then Jacob lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 servant women. And he put the servant women and their children first, and Leah and her children after them, and Rachel and Joseph after them. But he himself passed on ahead of them, and bowed down to the ground 7 times, until he came near to his brother. Then Esau ran to meet him, and embraced him, and fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they wept. And he lifted up his eyes, and saw the women and the children, and said, Who are these with you? And he said, The children whom God has graciously given your servant. Then the servant women came near with their children, and they bowed down. Leah likewise came near with her children, and they bowed down. And afterward Joseph came near with Rachel, and they bowed down. And he said, What do you mean by all these camps which I have met? And he said, To find favor in the sight of my Lord. But Esau said, I have plenty, my brother. Let what you have be your own. And Jacob said, No, please, if now I have found favor in your sight, then take my present from my hand. For I see your face as one sees the face of God, and you have received me favorably. Please take my blessing which has been brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have everything. Thus he urged him, and he took it. Then Esau said, Let us take our journey and go, and I will go before you. But he said to him, My Lord knows that the children are weak, and that the flocks and herds which are nursing are a care to me. And if they are driven hard one day, all the flocks will die. Please let my Lord pass on before his servant, and I will lead on slowly, according to the pace of the cattle that are before me, and according to the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord at Seir. Then Esau said, Please let me leave with you some of the people who are with me. But he said, Why do this? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth, and built for himself a house, and made booths for his livestock. Therefore the place is named Succoth. Now Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padan Aram, and he camped before the city. Then he bought a portion of a field where he had pitched his tent from the hand of the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 kesitah. Then he set up there an altar, and called it El Elohi Israel. Whether it was getting tricked or tricking others, Jacob worked hard for many years to accumulate what he has. He has gained a lot of possessions, he has grown a large family, and he has shaped an identity for himself. But it's interesting how it's understood from Jacob's perspective as he was talking with Esau. Verse 11, Please take my blessing which has been brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, because I have everything. Jacob understands that everything he has was given to him by God's grace. Not just the things he has, but what about the people with him? Verse 5, And he lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, and said, Who are these with you? And he said, The children whom God has graciously given your servant. He doesn't mention working 7 years for her and then another 7 years for her, but his family was given to him by God's grace. And even back in chapter 32, verse 28, Then the man said, Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. God has given Jacob a new identity. He's no longer Jacob the deceiver, grabbing what he can from his brother, but Israel, someone who knows how to struggle and wrestle with God and with men and prevail. Let's also remember that he prevailed not because of his own strength, he was wrestling with God. God was able to touch the socket of his thigh, and his thigh was immediately dislocated. God could have easily destroyed Jacob, but instead, God allowed Jacob to prevail so that God can give him a new identity along with everything else that God has been giving him. And so Jacob was right to seek God in prayer back in chapter 32. And the answer to that prayer was even greater humility. His strength definitely didn't come from any physical power, like we might remember from chapter 29, verse 10, when beautiful Rachel shows up and Jacob rolled away this heavy stone all by himself. He was instead made physically weak, his thigh dislocated. He was limping, but in his physical weakness, he still prevails because God let him prevail. He is now dependent on God's strength. And so now, strengthened by God, accepted by God, Jacob was able to, verse 3, pass on ahead of everybody and faced his brother, and no longer trying to take anything away from anybody. He has spiritually grown and is ready to lavish gifts for his brother. He didn't have to. Esau and Jacob were already reconciled. Verse 4, Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. But now Jacob's strength is not what he can take from people, but in humility, understanding God's grace, he is generous and can now give to people freely, even to someone like Esau, who had wanted to kill him. Has God been gracious to you? You've been wrestling with God, but has God given you a new identity? You've held tight to what you possess, but have you realized that everything you have has been graciously given to you by God? God is a gracious God. He gives grace to the humble. These are my thoughts. Hope to hear yours as well.